The entire philosophy of the way we structure our events is generative and emergent and regenerative, meaning that we organize ourselves probably like 2% of the programs. Everything else is done by the attendees.
Hello, ReFi Podcast. Today, we're back with a bonus episode with Timour Kosters, co-founder of Edge City, a society incubator dedicated to advancing human flourishing. We explored the emerging trend of month-long pop-up cities, where people at the frontiers of technology, science, and culture live and work together to imagine a better society. I appreciated Timour's raw take on what it actually takes to bring such a large number of people together for this experience, and how regeneration is reflected in the interdisciplinary nature of these social experiments.
I think the pop-up city trend is really interesting, and I'm curious to see whether in the long term it manages to compete or maybe complement the conference model more. My favorite thing about this conversation was the incubator aspect of pop-up cities, but it seemed that important community activation is just as crucial. I felt this was a very solid-frank conversation, but obviously there are many challenges to solve, like inclusion, democratic governance, or privacy. And I love that Timour opened up about those things too. Let's dive in. Hello, Timour. Welcome to the ReFi Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hi, Timour, and we're so excited to explore this emerging trend in the Web3 ecosystem and beyond of pop-up cities. And we'll go behind the scenes, learn the big why behind the movement, what actually it takes to put it together, and how regeneration is involved in the pop-up city movement.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm really excited.
Perfect. So let's start by, talking a little bit about you and your journey. And can you also share maybe what was your introduction to the concept of pop-up communities?
Yeah, totally. So my background academically is in math and economics. And then I spent the better part of my 20s. I had a brief stint as an investment banker, did not agree well to that system. And I spent the most of my 20s building startups and scaling startups in New York primarily. I started a company in the crypto space in 2017 called NashHash, which was far too early for its time, but essentially trying to create a platform for game theoretic incentives, the kinds of things that I was studying at university, and really had this sense of, wow, okay, here is Ethereum, here is, crypto and blockchain more generally, this entirely new way of thinking about systemic change, thinking about incentive systems, etc. And that really has been a through line throughout my work. I took a break after 2018 from the space, regrettably, because I was just quite burnt out on the ups and downs of that market and the kind of the public narrative and even the internal narrative in our industry. And then really, I started a company in a different space and then came back in 2021 during the kind of the DAO and NFT cycle. And again, was very invigorated by these concepts of, decentralized organizations and the systemic change that could potentially come from people coordinating in ways that, get rid of middlemen and create incentive systems that allow us to actually coordinate and build amazing things like, regenerative finance and things like that. I was one of the people running a fund called Seed Club Ventures. That was kind of my most recent job, let's say, before what I'm doing now. And we were doing a lot of DAO tooling investing. We're investing in DAOs themselves. We were really kind of quite broad in crypto. And funnily enough, the biggest hit that we had was a company called Stability AI, which pivoted from being using AI for DAOs to creating Stable Diffusion. It's kind of a well-known open source AI image model. And pretty much off the back of that was invited to an event called Zuzalu to run the AI track there. And Zuzalu is in many ways the origin point of a lot of what we'll talk about today. So I'll maybe spend a bit of time there. Basically, it was an idea created by Vitalik Buterin, who was just about 2 years ago now, was thinking, okay, so many people talking about the future of society, network states, network societies, network cities, even, people talking about crypto cities and what would it take to build something like that. But no one's actually doing anything, right? And at the time, Balaji's book, The Network State, was about a year old. No one had actually run any kind of tangible experiments. And Vitalik, to his credit, was like, let's just do it. Like, let's just see what happens, plant a flag and see what occurs. And so a small team formed around that, which included Janine Leger, who's my now co-founder. But basically, they said, okay, we're going to do 2 months. It's going to be in Montenegro. It's going to be on the sea. We're going to invite a bunch of people, see who turns up, and we're all going to live together. We're going to experiment with new ideas. We're going to incubate projects. We're going to learn from each other, etc. So I was lucky enough to attend and to help organize parts of it. And I think looking back, I just had a very personally meaningful experience there. And I think the reason for that is that I was able to express many different sides of my personality in this container. So obviously there was the intellectual side of it. I was, running tracks. I was giving talks and panels and things like that. I was learning a lot from other talks and panels and workshops. But it was also a very playful environment. It was kind of fun, we're all living there. It's like, this is weird, who are all these cool people? It's like, oh, I actually know a lot of them from Twitter, but now they're like IRL and they've got all their weird intricacies and idiosyncrasies of being humans, real humans. And so we were doing cold plunges and we were swimming in the sea and we were working out and sauna and going on hikes. And I got to DJ with Grimes, all these weird things were happening. I was like, man, this is really cool, actually. This is a really fundamentally interesting new format of gathering because it allows for kind of this like holistic experience for the individuals there, which connects them deeply with each other. And then you're also surrounded by people who actually build stuff and are interested in new ideas and, thinking about the world in interesting ways. Yeah. So essentially, long story short, I was like, hey, I kind of want to do this more. So I signed up to be a core organizer of the next event we did, which was called Zoo Connect, which happened in Istanbul. And after that, in a variety of community conversations and discussions with Vitalik, we basically decided to decentralize Zuzalu as a concept and encourage many people to try something similar. And so that happened about just a year and a half ago, which is kind of crazy to think about, but basically, it hasn't been very much time, but in that short span of time, so many new experiments have really flourished out of that singular event. And Edge City is one of them. That's the organization that I'm building with Janine. And our idea, which I think we'll get into, but just really, condense it down, is basically to create these series of pop-up cities or pop-up villages, the terminology is different, and create what we call a society incubator. So really like a real world place, laboratory to test new ideas, new technologies, new cultural practices, norms, etc., that advance human flourishing. So it's, looking back at kind of where I started, this has been the through line throughout the whole thing. Yeah, maybe I'll pause there and see what questions you guys have.
Yeah, we have a lot, and thanks for the backstory. And when you're describing the first Zuzalu, it honestly sounded like a camp for adults.
Yeah.
But then I love
totally.
that you bring up the idea of a society incubator, and we'll dive into that a bit more. But I'm curious, can you condense sort of the big why behind these incubators? Like, what problem is Edge City solving?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, one thing I'd say is that we are in terms of the things that people are working on, we are problem agnostic, meaning that some people come, really caring about climate. Some people come really caring about AI or, obviously blockchain, biotech, etc. So it's quite a diverse set of people in terms of the things that they're working on and the fields they come from, types of people that they are. So what we ourselves are trying to address is almost the meta problem of where do new ideas about society actually come from? And my thought is that, they come from kind of the obvious places, universities, people writing online, private markets, government institutions, obviously. And I think that in the world that we're stepping into and in the rapid pace of change that is already happening and will continue to accelerate, we just need more spaces for this kind of thinking, for this kind of experimentation. And we need to create places where people from a lot of different fields come together. They participate in this experience that allows them to really connect with each other meaningfully. So it's not like a conference, right? It's not like you get half an hour, 10 minutes with someone, you exchange contacts, never talk to them again. It's like, no, you get meaningful time with people and you can really go deep on ideas. You can really kind of iterate on the things that you're building. And then, so that's the environment. And then the things that people actually do there, right? They're learning, but they're also actually experimenting. They're also actually incubating and working on their projects or bringing, new projects to their lives. So I kind of see us as being a place where you can shortcut from idea to implementation, or actually not necessarily shortcut, but it's almost like if you imagine where, in normal life, ideation happens in certain places, like let's say think tanks, universities, etc., people writing books. Then incubation happens in other places like incubators or, people building things. And then implementation of the things that get built happen again in somewhere else, in cities, towns, communities, etc. It can happen online, right, with a lot of digital tech. We're kind of condensing all of that down into one place. That also happens to be a really fun, exciting place to just spend time, right? It's health focused, it's exciting, it's, people are connecting, they feel really good, they are themselves flourishing in that space. And so the idea is like, what comes out of that, right? What technologies get incubated in that kind of environment, as opposed to, you're sitting in an office building somewhere, you haven't spoken to a human for 5 days, you're, I don't know, trading meme coins or whatever, no shade to those people, but just like, it's a completely different environment. And therefore I think the things that get made out of it, the ideas, the tech, etc., will be completely different as well.
I really like this idea of creating, physical spaces for coordination and innovation. But also I've seen a lot of criticism of, pop-up cities becoming these communities for privileged few that just go somewhere around the world, fail to include the local community. So I'm also curious about what you have to say about that. And I remember in Chiang Mai when I went in October, there were probably like 5 or 6 pop-up communities. And there was a talk with Vitalik. And when asked what he thought about pop-up cities, he said that, the value proposition is still kind of being defined, but he personally saw it as an open university. So I feel like, there's still a lot of work to do when it comes to defining that. But yeah, if you can tell me how you respond to the criticism perhaps, and if there are any real world tangible applications that came out of these communities.
Yeah, totally. So there's a few things there, but I'll touch on them kind of one by one. I think first of all, just to say about everything I just said is in many ways aspirational. So we are in the process of building this thing. We're about a year into Edge City, maximum 2 years into the movement. So we're excited about a lot of these ideas and we're starting to see it happen. But it's still very much an aspiration that we're moving towards. Secondly, to touch on the criticism you mentioned, I think that's entirely valid. It's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. So there's 2 things you mentioned. One is the local participation, which is a very important part of the experience that we create. The reason we do this all over the world and not just in, the Bay Area or not just in traditional centers of innovation is that there is so much wisdom and learning, all over the world in different communities. And we specifically want to go to those places to be able to learn those things and then spread those learnings throughout the network. It also makes it much easier for us to make it accessible to someone who, might live in Southeast Asia and for whatever reason can't enter the US or can't make it to our event in California, but they can make it to the one in Chiang Mai, right? And so what's happening now is that, with Chiang Mai in November, we announced that we would be there. We kind of planted a flag. Slowly after that, other villages started saying, hey, we're also going to be there, or hey, we're also going to do 2 weeks alongside this. And so you had this incredible diversity, actually. I think it was actually more than 10, maybe even a dozen of different pop-up concepts. Some focused on different themes like ZK, some focused on just a different type of community, different types of people. We focus a lot on making it multi-generational, making it a really good place to be, a place to actually incubate tech, but other people have different approaches. And so it does start to approximate this kind of decentralized campus, right? Where people can pop in to different villages. But it's spread out, not just in space, but also in time, right? So you can go to different ones throughout the year, etc. So it does start to feel kind of like a university experience, like Vitalik's saying, but maybe more for the networked age. And then to touch on the second thing you mentioned with, making sure these things aren't just something fun for privileged people. I think that's something I think about a lot. I think if this movement does fail, it will be to the extent that it doesn't live up to its potential, and it's just like a fun thing that a bunch of, relatively privileged people did, where they lived together for a month and then nothing came out of it. We're working very hard to make sure that doesn't happen. So the way we address that specifically is, one, just making it as accessible as possible to people. So we, have a large number of discounted tickets. We have a large number of scholarship tickets for young builders, people building something interesting, but, haven't, made enough money to be able to afford it. We're also a foundation. We're a nonprofit. So our entire cost structures flow through, meaning we make no money, no profit, at least. So the amount that it costs to put on the event is the amount that people pay. And then even with all that, the one tricky thing is that events, gatherings, anything that involves people in a place are by definition exclusive. They have to be. There is some capacity constraint above which you can't go. So you can't have everybody. So the question is, how do you fix that, right? One is we live stream a lot of the content. So if people want to learn, they can. We make the hackathon accessible from anywhere in the world. So if you want to participate, you can. We open source all of our learnings. This is maybe the most important thing. It's like, I don't want Edge City to be the only pop-up city concept, right? We're going to build an incredible network, but I think we're just constrained by the amount of time that we have and various other constraints. I think for the good of, coming back to the bigger vision of creating space, surface area for experimentation in the world, for figuring out what the world should look like post AGI and big questions like this, I think there need to be like 1,000 concurrent experiments running. And I don't imagine Edge City will be all of those, but we are trying to inspire that movement. So we share all of our learnings. It's bloody hard to do this, I will say, but we're trying to make it as easy as possible by telling people the mistakes that we made and those gotchas. So we're going to update a playbook soon. We have a V1 of that on a Notion page, but we want to make it like actually really tangible and easy to use. So I'll pause there, and then I can get into the more like tangible examples and things, but I just want to make sure we address those points.
Yeah, thanks for being real about what really goes into the thinking behind making it accessible, yet the mere reality of hosting events. And I appreciate open sourcing the learnings. I think it's a great way to reflect the Web3 ethos in the work that you're doing at Edge City. And before we jump into actually logistics and more kind of behind the scenes, I'm curious, what's the most common misconception? What do people usually get wrong about Edge City?
Yeah, let me answer that, and then also try to answer the prior question, because when I listen to podcasts and a question goes unanswered, I'm a little bit like, I wish they actually went back to it. So to touch on the thing of like what actually gets incubated there, and maybe this is the misconception that people have, like, oh, people are just going for a month and they're hanging out and, going on hikes together or whatever. There is actual building that happens, and I think that's very important. And something that we really want to cultivate more of. Again, like, I don't want our gatherings to just be a good time. Like, I fundamentally believe that there will be new things, like novel things that will get incubated out of these spaces that could not have come out of a think tank or an incubator, like a traditional incubator, or the government or the private market. Like, something about this format is very special. So to make that concrete, we have started to partner with organizations to run kind of experiments, applied experiments. For example, there is an organization called Radical Exchange, which was started by Vitalik and Glenn Weil and a few others. And they do a lot of thinking about kind of the future of political economy and things like this. And for a long time, they've wanted to run a community currency experiment. But it's very difficult to do that in real life for a number of reasons. People are just doing their thing. They don't really want to try this new concept, or how do you get people to be close enough together, either in physical space or digital space, that there's actually surface area for them to interact with each other. And so in our conversations with Matt Pruitt, who's the president of Radical Exchange, we realized, like, wait, we're actually kind of the perfect place to test run something like this, right? And for us, it's great because it's a super high potential, high leverage idea that hasn't really kicked off or hasn't really been successfully showcased anywhere. Obviously, there have been many community currency experiments throughout history, but they mostly kind of peter out. So we're like, cool, let's try it. So they conceptualized what we called Edges, which is like the Edge City community currency. It's not even a crypto thing. It's kind of, for now, run as a super lightweight, easy experiment, like as a database. And people have to essentially buy in. They have to kind of, stake some cash. They get edges in return, and they can use that between themselves for a variety of things, right? We had some ideas like, maybe people will trade things that they own, or maybe people will trade services. In the end, as always with these things, people end up being extremely creative and surprising you. So I think, I can't recall what the weirdest thing was, but people were like babysitting each other's kids in return for edges, or going out. Like we ran this experiment in California and in Thailand at two different pop-up villages that happened 6 months apart. And the first one was in California, and a lot of those lessons were kind of implemented, iterated on, and we did it again in Thailand. And in Thailand, people were going out to the markets in beautiful Chiang Mai, taking things and then bringing them back to like a spontaneous market that happened kind of at our venue, and then like trading those goods in exchange for edges. So there was even starting to be some interaction with the actual local economy in the place that we were. So yeah, I think that's kind of a really cool example of the types of things that can be experimented on in these spaces. Pretty much anything that requires a critical mass of people who are in the mode of wanting to try something new could benefit from something like this. I'll give another example just quickly. There is a team called Cursive, who are a cryptography and design lab. And we've been working with them for a number of years, actually since the Zuzulu days. And essentially, they use pretty frontier cryptographic primitives like multi-party computation, fully homomorphic encryption, to allow experiences like human connection experiences that wouldn't otherwise be possible. So for example, they had everyone that was at Edge City Lana, which was the event in Thailand, had a wristband that was made by Cursive that had an NFC chip, and you could tap anyone's NFC chip and it would come up with the shared interests that you guys have in common. And what's happening there is that all of that computation for your shared interests is happening without sending any of your information to any server. It's all completely privacy preserving. So it's doing something called private set intersection, where it knows, what you're into, it knows what they're into. It can compute the set of those, like the intersection of those interests, and return it back to you without revealing anything to anyone other than you and the person you're tapping with. These are, and Vitalik featured this in a recent blog post, and it's just kind of the early signs of this world that we've been talking about, and in the case of cryptography has been theorized for decades now, and it's just cool to see it happen on the ground. Again, it's the kind of thing where like, yeah, I guess you could run that sort of experiment in a normal town potentially, or in a normal city, but we just have the ability to like force people to do it, right? Because the wristbands are necessary for being part of the event. So it's just kind of a fun canvas on which we can try stuff out. And then the Cursive team, after iterating at our events a few times, are now working with the DEF CON team and those events. That's obviously a much bigger audience, still contained, still a good like experimentation layer, but you can see how it can start to scale into bigger and bigger groups.
Okay, I love hearing about these experiments. And it also makes me think about when I was at ETH Prague last year, they had the ZooPass application that you needed to use for ticketing and I guess like building up the reputation. So it's great to see that. It also makes me think a lot about public goods funding, because there was a big topic when I was in Argentina for Alep Crecimiento in August. And I know that at the time they were talking about, different ways they could fund what matters to the communities in pop-up cities, whether that's through quadratic funding, whether that's through retroactive funding, hypercerts and things like that. And they were kind of coming up with really cool ideas for it. And I thought it's amazing because first, again, that we make sure that the money goes really where the community wants it to go. But second, that it also serves as like important signaling for, maybe what we want to see more of, what we want to see less of. So I'm wondering, do you also experiment with that and maybe with some kind of governance mechanisms?
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I mean, this is why I'm like in this space to begin with. So yeah, I mean, of the things you just mentioned, we obviously will not take even necessarily partial credit for all of them, but Crecimiento was incubated at Edge City Denver in the sauna. The idea, the spark of it happened and eventually it snowballed and has become this incredible, for those who don't know, it's this essentially like a movement that's currently happening in Argentina to really advance crypto adoption in a place that, there's already so much adoption. There's a lot of need for various reasons, and there's just a lot of excitement. So it's been incredible to see that team, pick that up and run with it and iterate on the pop-up city model. And we're, still very much involved there and most likely will be doing something in Argentina soon. So yeah, that's amazing. ZooPass has been with us since the start and we continue to be excited and work with that team. It's another really good example actually of a team where we really put in the effort early on to support them, to give them a space to experiment. And then, they were used at DevConnect, they were used at DevCon. I didn't even know about ETH Prague, but that's amazing. So yeah, I mean, these things are, I think from the outside can look like, interesting, but okay, come back when lots of people are using it. But for us, it's very exciting because we can see the beginnings or the glimmers of what can become incredibly important and scalable technologies, right? Someone referred to Edge Esmeralda, this founder, Laura Deming, who has created a cryogenics company, incredible person, incredible work. And we were talking to her about Edge Esmeralda, which was our California event. She was like, yeah, I think people will look back at this event or, the next couple of these in the same way that they look back at like Harvard in the early Facebook days, where it kind of just had to come from there, right? Like that's where it almost had to spawn and then spread. And so it feels like we're in the early days of things like that. And so to your question about, governance mechanisms and funding mechanisms, we are just very excited. We're definitely running experiments. There's all kinds of different things happening. For example, I know you had Glenn Wall on your show, and I am a huge fan of the ideas behind Plurality, the book that him and Audrey Tang co-wrote. And, there even I'm thinking like, okay, how do we actually create a space where these ideas can be used and incubated? And we had discussions around this in Thailand. I think we'll continue to push that forward in future events. What if we actually elevate something, a tool like Polis, which is pol.is for people that aren't familiar, highly recommend checking it out, what if we elevate something like that to the level of actual community governance, right? And we start to make really important decisions, or at least start to create sense-making tools that are, similar to these ideas. We've had a few things like this. We had a team called Tiny Cloud, who were doing something cool in Thailand. They were basically recording a lot of the talks and the sessions and the workshops that happened, and then feeding them into kind of a central information database that then created, if folks are familiar with Obsidian or Roam Research, but essentially it's like a shared, let's say, knowledge graph. So there was kind of a knowledge graph being co-created throughout the time. And then obviously now with LLMs, you can query that quite easily. And it's just interesting. You're like, oh, cool. I can ask this entity, this kind of knowledge base that has all of the talks, the dozens and dozens of talks and sessions and even side conversations for those who consented to recording their notes and shared them. Suddenly you can start to query like this community graph, right? So I'm very excited about this stuff. I am cautiously optimistic that something really cool is like right around the corner. It feels like we're like touching on it, like community knowledge graph, community funding mechanisms, obviously quadratic voting, quadratic funding. We've been using those tools. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like, if we chat 12 months from now, we're going to look back and be like, oh, of course, that was the thing,
Yeah, I enjoy your excitement and optimism for the future. We need more of that, I believe.
Yeah.
And so far, we've touched on technology, Web3, ZK, and now talk about governance, community, and public goods. And this leads me into regeneration, right? A big theme for this podcast. And when we spoke before, you've mentioned that, regeneration is more of a through line, like a framework that touches into a lot of things that you're doing at Edge City. And so you don't have region focused explicit programming at your events, from what I understand, but it's more of this through line, like you mentioned. I'm curious if you can give us an example of how this through line is reflected in the work of Edge City. And one other thing, just an observation from the way you speak about Edge City, when you even the word the edge, and in your blogs you talk about that innovation happens at the edges, and I'm a huge fan of interdisciplinary research and work. This actually reminds me of one of the regenerative principles of John Fullerton, who runs the Capital Institute and teaches the course in regenerative economics. One of the principles for regenerative economy is that the innovation happens at the edges, and that's where regeneration happens, because in natural world, that's where the most biodiversity actually exists. When, for example, the river flows into the sea, and this, area of mixing the fresh water and salt water, this is where this regeneration is booming. So it's interesting to see that kind of reflected on almost in the concept of Edge City. But yeah, curious to hear your take on where regeneration is in Edge City and in your programming.
Yeah, totally. It's a really cool question. I mean, I listened to the podcast you guys did with John. I wasn't familiar with his work before, but now I kind of want to even take that course or get to know him better, because the ideas are very applicable. And I think this touches on the way that Edge City and the concept of regenerative models overlap and intersect. And to me, the place that happens is in the concept of like fundamental systemic change. Meaning, when I listen to people like John and you guys talk about ReFi, I think, man, these ideas are so cool. And if you really dig down and think about it, I think most people would agree, depending how you frame it. But it is also fundamentally different to many of the ways that things currently run, right? And when I think about that, I think, okay, obviously age-old debate, do you change from within or do you create the alternative? And I think that Edge City is almost just a place where you can play with that, right? Like if you want to create the alternative, you can start the ReFi village, and everything that runs there is done in ReFi principles. And you can just show people, hey, how amazing is this, right? But you can also come to, a different type of Edge City or a different type of pop-up city, and have the experience of, having that not be a core theme, but you're interfacing with the head of a, foundational AI company or someone building, a blockchain ecosystem or, a biotech product. And in that space, it's just much easier to discuss ideas like that are fundamentally new. And maybe it's naive, but you could actually have an impact on the way that these people think about the thing that they're building. So to that point, I think, regeneration is a through line. We probably have had sessions on it, by the way, I should say. Like we have very emergent programming, right? The entire philosophy of the way we structure our events is generative and emergent and regenerative, meaning that we organize ourselves probably like 2% of the programs. Everything else is done by the attendees. And so we're constantly surprised and also sometimes even unaware of sessions that happened. I've talked to people who are like, oh my God, I went to this session in Thailand and it was this and this by this person. I was like, I completely missed that. Like I did not know that was happening, but that sounds amazing. So you probably have had regen focused programs or at least sessions and workshops. But yeah, there's almost just, I'd say that the way that it overlaps more closely is this almost theory of change, of, hey, we just need new spaces where we can create these tools and we can run these experiments. And I think that's just incredibly important.
Beautiful. Yeah, I think if we happen to have a conversation 1 year from now, we'll definitely ask you, if you were able to maybe integrate more, I would say like obvious regenerative practices. One example that comes to mind is the traditional Dream Factory, which is a regenerative community in Portugal, where I think could be some beautiful intersections with pop-up communities as well. So yeah, a lot of great work happening there. But I'm curious, when we're talking about maybe planning future pop-up cities, or I want to know maybe what goes into planning in the first place, because I can imagine it's like a whole beast. So you mentioned the playbook that you were planning to update. Maybe can you tease it a little bit by talking about some of these key lessons that you had about planning and scouting locations and working with the local communities?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so the first thing is that it's annoyingly difficult right now to do this. And the reason is that existing infrastructure is just not created for this type of thing. Hard to find a place where a village-sized group of people can spend a month, right? Maybe I should have touched on this early on, but part of the reasoning for this is that for just this entire thing of like why we're even doing this, the way that Vitalik explained it early on was basically, okay, we have all these events where, thousands of people gather for a day or two, right? Conferences, festivals, whatever. And then we have other events where dozens of people gather for a few months, like hacker houses and things like that. There's not really anything in the middle that pushes in both directions. And so trying to house 1,000 people and, let's say 500 full-time, 500 visitors throughout the month, and do it for something like a month or two is just really difficult. So biggest challenge is finding the right places. 2 has been explaining what on earth we're doing, right? Like you can even tell in just the nomenclature that people use. Pop-up city, pop-up village. These are not perfect descriptions of what's happening. It sounds a little bit like a pop-up store, it has that connotation, or you're like, pop-up city, like what does that mean? Is that Burning Man? So there's let's say just the top of funnel, like the go-to-market component of trying to convince people to come to your kind of weird sounding thing, which we're starting to improve. And many more people now know about Edge City than a year ago. Therefore, many more people are aware of things like this. So hopefully it's kind of the tide that raises all boats, and other pop-up cities that come after us will have an easier time because they'll have something concrete to point to. So that's a big one. And then look, there's just the logistical complexity. It's just difficult to organize things like this. There's the, curation versus openness debate that we touched on. Like, how do you actually create a good container? How do you be open to all kinds of different people, but still make sure that you don't get folks that, make it difficult for other people? And what systems do you have? What community processes do you have to deal with things like that? Deal with, disagreements between people and things like that, conflict resolution. So we're lucky to have a lot of experience in community building. We have a lot of community members who have spent decades living in community houses in SF or in Europe, they've just built this as second nature, right? Like they just know how to do things like this. And so we are very lucky to have folks like that. I'd say the last challenge that comes to mind is, how do you fund things like this? So we are, kind of for many reasons deciding to run the events through a foundation, through a nonprofit. The key thing is that just the business model of events is really bad. It's just really hard to make money. And not that we're necessarily trying to get, rich off this, but if you're trying to get rich off doing events, good luck. That's not the way to do it. So we have done the work to be able to make these events break even. I'm almost certain Edge City is the only organizations that has been able to do that. And that's through a mix of just a lot of, relevant experience on the team, being super scrappy. It's related to, how we structured the team, etc. But even if you can make the events break even, and even if you can, survive the year, you still need working capital, right? Events are difficult in that way too, where you need the money up front. So there's just kind of logistical stuff to deal with. The way we've decided to structure it is, again, events through the nonprofit. We, might start a for-profit entity later down the line for some of the ideas that we're creating and building ourselves and things like that. And I think that's also okay, right? Sustainability is important. Long-term sustainability is difficult often. And maybe there's a way to do that in a regenerative way that is kind of has a feedback loop back into the community that helps to grow it. That's, those are ideas that we're exploring and actively thinking about. Yeah, I would say those are the biggest challenges.
Thanks for being real about them. And I totally agree with your point is, you have to have your own glass full before you can help others. So I don't think there's anything wrong about focusing on creating this sustainable and regenerative model of running experiences like this in order to incubate regeneration for the broader society. And, not that is a challenge, but I wonder if that could be another potential challenge. Earlier you mentioned that, multiple pop-up cities emerged out of the original Zuzalu movement. And I'm curious, how do you approach this collaboration versus competition aspect of it? How do you navigate your relationship with other pop-up cities, especially, you mentioned in Thailand, you announced Edge City and then multiple other villages also came in. You have some more coming up in the future. Yeah. Do you compete for the same crowd? Do you collaborate?
It's a great question. I would love to, we very much see this as kind of a positive sum environment and positive sum industry. I would love to continue that. I think thus far, like this movement had to be born. I think it made sense to be born out of the blockchain space. So most of the pop-up city experiments are blockchain related. Even some of the ones that are quite specific to health, biotech, longevity, things like Vitalia, they are still fundamentally have a deep rooting in the blockchain space. And we do too. We are just doing the work to get those ideas, get the ideas that we've all been creating in this beautiful, milieu of crypto out into the wider world. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we're doing the work to be very multidisciplinary. We're bringing in folks from AI, from biotech. We're bringing in artists and philosophers and people spending their times building families and thinking of new education systems and things like that. So I don't know that we're necessarily competing for the same people right now. I also don't think that there's some ceiling necessarily or some, that the total addressable market of people interested in having, living in a flourishing away for a month and incubating a brighter future is necessarily that capped. But yeah, to answer your question specifically in terms of cooperation, competition, we feel like cooperation is the right move, and no one has yet, discouraged us from that stance. But I think the difficulty we have is just time and capacity. And we get a lot of emails and DMs and conversations of people being like, hey, I want to do something like this. What, let's jump on a call. And I'm like, Matt, I'm trying to minimize the number of calls I have in a week just to stay sane. And even then I'm failing, because just to make this one succeed. So if anyone's listening and they're like, oh, Timour did not answer my DM on Twitter, I'm so sorry. But I think it's more, I hope that by demonstrating that this can work, Edge City will kind of, drive the movement forward and show what's possible. And I guarantee in, the next 5 years, someone else is going to come with a new idea, and it's going to be fun, shiny, and have success as well. Hopefully many of those will come. So that's my current convoluted stance on that.
I love it. And speaking of, the crowd, and I appreciate actually you expanding outside of the Web3 bubble. And that's something that we are really trying to do with the podcast as well. Is, I believe it's important to reach across the aisle and connect worlds rather than build in isolation and bring in newer, fresher audiences. I think that's a wonderful trajectory. And I'm curious, what's an ideal participant look like for you, or versus a nightmare one for Edge City?
So we look for people who are curious, kind, and high agency. And what that means is people who are curious to learn more and interested in, what other people are doing, interested to learn more, feel progression in their own learning and their own abilities. Kind, meaning no assholes. It doesn't mean you have to be nice to everybody. Sometimes the kindest thing is to give someone, candid feedback. But yeah, I think that one speaks for itself, and something I actually care about quite deeply. And then high agency, meaning people who feel that they are able to, do things in the world. Agency was described to me as doing stuff-ivity. And, we look for people who are high on that scale. It doesn't mean you're just a founder, or we just take scientists, or we just take, successful people. It means that there's just a general feeling of you can do stuff. You can just do stuff in the world. You might be, a Nobel Prize winner, or you might be building a family, right? You might be writing a research paper, or writing a book, or writing a blog, or creating content in other ways. There's not like we do index heavily on software developers and tech people, but I think that's just because we are tech people. And so that those are the circles that are first hearing about this. But I think in the kind of the logical conclusion of all of this is that ideally we create containers that have a huge variety of different approaches to building and to creating interesting things, right? We kind of want to almost put little teams together, right? Your experience as an attendee might be that you come for the whole month, and every week you're in just another group of 6 to 10 people, and you're a founder, and you might have a designer and a web developer, but also like a policymaker from South Africa, and like, philosopher, and etc. And it's like, cool, what are you guys going to do together, right? Like what comes out of that bubble? And I think with AI, we'll be getting even better at putting people together in things that make sense, configurations that could lead to something interesting and just be a cool experience for people. But yeah, so that's how we think about that side of things. I think bad participants is less fun to talk about, but it's a reality. Every community, every meaningful community that I've been a part of has had to deal with this, where some folks are just not a good fit, and that's okay. That doesn't mean they're a bad person. It just means it's just not a good fit, right? And it takes a difficult conversation sometimes, or a difficult set of conversations. Ideally, those are handled in a way that's democratic and community driven and community led. I've learned a lot about this from a community in France called Fatopia, where I've spent some time. Essentially like almost a commune that spawns every winter for 6 months. Lots of artists and tech people and things, and they live in a beautiful chateau, and it's amazing. And a lot of those people came from a co-living network called the Embassy, which is mainly in San Francisco. And so those learnings have compounded over time, and they have, a community board that changes, I think, on a weekly or a monthly basis, that's specifically there to deal with difficult situations like that. That's been very inspiring to us, because at first we thankfully have not had that many issues. But usually if something does come up, it comes up at a time when we as the team are just in, already at 110% capacity. And that's just not sustainable. So yeah, I think creating systems for that is very important.
Awesome. Makes me think of a saying that my friend always tells me, like, if you want to plan something, never do it with more people that can fit into a car. And it's so true, because if you have 4 or 5 or more people than that, it always becomes a little messy, and it's important to have mechanisms to work against that. I know another friend told me about the Gathering of Tribes, which happened last year, I think also in Portugal or Spain, where they did a lot to invest in the practice of conflict mediation and all that. So that's really beautiful to hear. I think we're also getting a little bit into the spicy questions territory. So you said that you don't mind sharing the messy as well. So I want to ask, do you feel like you had a situation that you really felt like you messed up? And how did work to solve it?
Yeah, so about 3 days before Edge City Lana started, this was the event we did in Thailand, there was a record flood that hit Chiang Mai. And there was a moment of, and it happened to hit the area where our event was going to be, like a little bit harder. And there's definitely a moment of like, oh my God, we just invited, for, the first week, 200 people were going to arrive. Many more came later, but at first 200. We're 200 people are flying in, and our main venue is underwater, like if covered with mud, and you can't even get there because you need a boat. That I definitely felt like, man, maybe we messed up. Obviously not at all our fault, but there was a sense of like, what are we doing? Is this just too much? But then the beautiful thing was that it ended up being the most incredible thing in multiple ways. Obviously deeply tragic for the local community, but it brought us closer to them in a way that I think, frankly, it wouldn't have necessarily naturally happened, at least not in the first few days. We basically just we dropped everything. We were like, okay, we just need to help. And so we had all these volunteers coming from all over, people that were arriving, just getting involved in cleaning up. I didn't know this, but the main thing after a flood, obviously there's kind of infrastructural issues, but after the water recedes, which it did, the main thing is just cleaning things up, and there's mud everywhere. It's extremely impactful for local communities. They can't open their stores. They can't get their restaurants back on track, things like that. And so we just had, dozens of people, eventually more than that, donating funds because they were seeing what was happening in real time, getting involved in like volunteering and cleanup and going to stores, just buying food from restaurants. It sounds so trivial, but these people, I mean, they genuinely had often, at least in my experience, we would go, we'd interact with them, and they would have tears in their eyes because they were like, where did you guys come from? Like, what is this? Because they were ready for just a month of trying to get back on their feet and, no one coming to their stores because you could barely even come to that part of the town. And we were like, well, we have no other choice. We are going to be here and we're going to get through this with you guys. So that was quite meaningful. And it ended up really just being the most incredible way to start a month like this. I think also just a good reminder to our community that I'd say, again, if you're flying into Thailand from the US or from Europe, like you're probably on the, relatively more privileged end of the scale. And I think for a lot of people, myself included, the idea of climate change feels like kind of an abstract concept. It's like, yeah, I know it's bad. And yes, I'm, trying to do my part. But when you really understand that these freak events are becoming more and more common, I think, especially that week. So this was October 2024. There was some crazy fire happening. I think it was in California, and there was flooding happening in Italy at the exact same time. And these things weren't even in the news, right? Because there's just so much of it. So you just start to realize like, oh, this is going to become more and more common. This is going to be a real lived experience for so many people. And there they were, our attendees who arrived and were suddenly thigh deep in mud water, trying to help people move their stuff to like a dry location. So yeah, there was something, obviously terrible circumstance, but maybe the semblance of a silver lining there.
Thanks for sharing this story. I was just going to say, it maybe Mother Nature was trying to tell you something. Maybe Edge City does need some more explicit regen programming. Put it out there. It's a humbling experience, right? Of humanity and against the nature. Actually, not against, right? We're a fundamental part of it. And how can we implement that more in how we live? And as we conclude, just briefly, I'm curious about your thoughts on the future of pop-up cities. Where do you see this movement going? Is the goal for these pop-up cities to become permanent cities to replace the current urban landscape? Or is there something more to it?
Yeah. So I think the best way for me to answer that is just to give you a sneak peek of our super secret master plan, which we will share as soon as I have time to like word it properly and write the essay. But basically, this is kind of, the steps that we want to follow and that we encourage people to like steal our ideas and do the same. So first of all, we start with pop-up villages and we make them spaces that people actually want to visit. So they're designed for fun, playfulness, they're health focused, you're creative, but you're also productive. You meet amazing people and you live your best life, right? It's like community at its best. And that's how we attract awesome people to come. Then step 2 is we need to prove that these places can actually incubate real breakthroughs. So it's not just a good time. We need to actually start to show that there's interesting projects happening here that are, actual startups, actual prototypes, new fields of research forming, new social experiments that are really like can stand on their own legs in terms of being something interesting and important. We already have at least 5 examples of each of those, which is exciting. I think we need like an order of magnitude more than that, ideally this year. Step 3 is to build a global network of these villages. Again, ideally Edge City is a small part of that, but we will be building our own global network. So we have villages coming up. We have an event in the US, in Austin, in about a month. Then we'll be in South Africa. Then we'll have a pop-up village in California. That's kind of our first half of the year. We have many others announced around the world that will come later this year and next year. So we're kind of creating this global tapestry, finding ways to, create links between those places. So ideas that get incubated in one place can come to another and share learnings there. And then as we're doing that, step 4 is to actually start to incubate the technology and like the tech stack that this network city uses, right? So we're already developing open source tools so that others can replicate this. There's a bunch of people doing interesting work, teams like Social Layer and Dymo and Cursive and ZooPass, etc. So that's already starting to form. And we're kind of creating the framework for that. Basically, anyone who wants to do something like this should be able to do it easily and then tap into the rest of, the network. It doesn't have to be crazy software. It can be quite lightweight. We're not trying to like reinvent, things, or at least not yet. Right now, we're just creating simple, identity primitives, things like ticketing, things like connecting people when they're actually there. And then the fifth step is to your point, using these temporary pop-up cities to over time incubate permanent spots. So we're already doing this in California. The reason we are doing a second event in California 2 years in a row in the exact same place is that we are partnering with a new town project called Esmeralda. And so the event is called Edge Esmeralda. And the creator of that town, Devin Zugel, she is a brilliant thinker and writer, and has had this dream for a long time to create a walkable, family-friendly town in California that is focused on lifelong learning and creating like a very dynamic and fun place for families and for people in general. And what's cool is that Edge Esmeralda, the event, the month-long pop-up village, was able to actually bring a ton of energy and excitement and like to that area. We hosted it 10 minutes away from where the new town will be, and, actually show what it will be like to live there, right? Because if you're building a new town, you might have a deck, you might talk to people, you might have calls one-on-one and be like, oh, it's going to be like this, it's going to be like this. Or it's like actually just come and role play it for a month and you get a full on, experience of it. So she said just that 1 month event accelerated her project by, several years. So there's already this sense of, pop-ups finding essentially product market fit with permanent physical locations. It doesn't have to be a new town. It could be a new city. I've been spending time in Bhutan. They're building a new city there. It could be a new kind of just a big real estate project that's interesting in some capacity. So yeah. And the cool thing is that all of the things I mentioned before about like the tech stack and the community and everything that we're developing then starts to be the layer for these new permanent places. So then you start to create permanent cities that from the ground up can have a truly like frontier tech stack that can have norms and practices that use frontier technologies from the beginning. It could be Polis for community decision-making plus some kind of community AI model that helps to run those meetings or run those decision-making processes, etc. And so the final step is just demonstrate a better way of living, right? That's new. That's using these new tools, using these new ideas that ideally is regenerative at its core. And I think in doing that, there's this Buckminster Fuller quotes, like it's much easier to create something better and demonstrate an alternative rather than trying to, change it from within, as we were talking about. So I think in doing that, over time, governments, city governments will start to pay attention. They'll be like, this is actually something really interesting that's happening here. There's this whole global network of people that are running their own experiments. They're learning, they're sharing what they're doing. And I think that's how we, change culture over time. So that's kind of our end game, I guess.
I appreciate the big vision behind the project and very ambitious undertaking. And I'm excited to see what comes out of this movement. Truly, it's super fascinating to me. And in the little time that we have left, we always end the episode with rapid fire questions. We did change them up a tiny bit, not all of them, from our regular season 4. So are you ready?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Cool. The first one, my favorite, do you have a personal mantra or quote that you live by or that has shaped you as a person?
It's so embarrassing. I have a quote that I have at the top of my notes document. It's basically, there's nothing to fear. Just go for it. Play to win. Don't play to not lose.
My second one would be, if you could draw a pop-up city anywhere around the world tomorrow, where would it be and why?
Oh, it's such a good question. Like I mentioned, I've been spending time in Bhutan, and it is just the most incredible place for so many reasons. I've had many meaningful moments there, and I would love to do something there eventually.
Also my bucket list destination. And the last question is, what's the most unexpected skill you've had to learn while running Edge City?
Oh man, it's so crazy. I do everything from the high level, big picture, strategic stuff to like, sometimes just bring the toilet paper to the bathroom if no one else can do that. But in terms of the actual skill, I've gotten way better at Figma, and I've been generating a lot of the art that is on our sites in collaboration with an amazing artist called Nico. But that's been something that I did not expect to have to get into and have so much fun doing beforehand.
Well, congratulations on that, because I've seen some of them and they look amazing. They look like very solar punk to me. That's inspiring. Awesome. Well, Timour, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a very exciting conversation, and I hope that Maya and I and our listeners as well will have a chance to, experience the Edge experience sometime this year. And hopefully, we can keep in touch and see how we are progressing with Regeneration and beyond.
I would love that. And if I could just plug the next events that we have. So we'll be in Austin for kind of a micro pop-up village, March 2nd to 7th. We'll be in South Africa for another, we're calling it like an expedition. It's like a scouting trip, which will be April 3rd to 12th. And then we'll be in California for Edge Esmeralda, May 24 to June 21st. And that's kind of the big flagship for the first half of the year. And thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Timour. We'll make sure to include all the links at the episode description. Thank you.
Amazing.
Take care.
Thank you.
Take care.